Good day, C3RF members and friends across Canada and indeed around the world, and welcome to another session of In Hot, where we roll in on targets that are of interest to your civil liberties and their maintenance. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have with us one Ken Drysdale, who is the chairman of the commissioners of the National Citizens Inquiry that looked into all the aspects of Canada's response to the Wuhan virus. And Ken is a dedicated professional with a remarkable career spanning over 4 decades. He has extensive experience as a professional engineer, where he has an impressive 29 years at the helm of national and regional engineering businesses, where he played pivotal roles in their development and management. Ken currently holds the esteemed position of chairman of the Independent Commissioners of the National Citizens Inquiry. He is also celebrated as the co-author of the groundbreaking 5,342-page investigative report titled Inquiry into the Appropriateness and Efficacy of the COVID-19 Response in Canada. He's also the author of the compelling 89-page investigative report, Investigation into Criminal Allegations Concerning COVID-19 Pandemic Response. Ken, it's a real pleasure to have you on board, and I must say the work of the NCI is prodigious. It is really groundbreaking. And I'd like to ask you about NCI, the National Citizens Inquiry, what it was about and how you got wrapped up in it. Could you explain, please?
Absolutely. And good morning, by the way. The National Citizens Inquiry was an idea that came about in the summer of 2022. And what really prompted it was Canadians were watching what was going on with the federal government investigating all of the scandals. And as you know, there was also an investigation by Mr. Rollo into the evocation of the Emergencies Act. And Canadians were just tired of the corruption and the partisanship of these things. I mean, you know, time after time, the government had been convicted, if you will, of misdeeds, and there was no penalty. You know, it was washed away. You know, the Rollo inquiry, really, in the end, they said, well, you could have said it was good, and you could have said it wasn't, and we had to wait till just a few weeks ago to get a ruling of a federal court, which of course the government is now going to fight in the Supreme Court, I believe. So Canadians were, you know, what happened during the pandemic was the most outrageous intrusion of the government into the fundamental human rights, and not just human rights, the fundamental relationship between people in this country. And yet there was no investigation, and the government had probably no ability to do a proper nonpartisan investigation. Canadians wanted one. So essentially the people of Canada got together and they put this thing together. You know, National Citizens Inquiry had thousands and thousands of volunteers working for it across the country. I think maybe we had 2 or 3 paid assistants throughout the whole process. You know, every dime that was spent came from Canadians. There was no government money. There were no pharmaceutical company money. There was no larger corporate dollars. It was all money from everyday Canadians. You know, and as I said, most people were volunteers. Myself, for instance, you know, I spent 2.5 months traveling the country, and I spent 1,500 hours writing the report, and I got rich on my salary. My salary was $1, and I have to say the National Citizens Inquiry never paid me that dollar.
a dollar a day, man.
I'm hoping it comes in a nice framed but you know, so what did we do in order to investigate? What they did was we set up a commission, and the responsibility of the commission was to organize the volunteers together and organize how we would hear Canadians' testimony. And Canadians from all walks of life were invited to participate, and they just go onto the website and they'd submit what they wanted to say and what their credentials were, and that was reviewed. And then we had thousands of people who submitted their stories. And you know, we actually visited 8 cities and 3 days of testimony in each city. So we had 24 days of testimony from coast to coast in Canada. So we could only accommodate 304 or 305 witnesses, 90 some odd, I think it's 92 or 94. I'll just refer to my notes. 94 were experts in
Yes.
their fields.
Mhm.
And so we didn't restrict the scope. And so, you'd have a witness coming in talking about how they lost their job. You'd have an expert witness coming in and talking about policing or genetics or the biology of the biological treatments. We had teachers, we had courier drivers, we had people from the military, we had lawyers, we had just a wide scope of people that touched on almost every aspect of society. And so that kind of led to, when we had to write a report, we were charged with writing a report that reflected the stories of Canadians. And by the way, each of these witnesses testified under oath, and they were cross-examined not just by lawyers, but by the commissioners themselves.
Yes.
So at the end of this, we videotaped all of the testimony. It was held in a semi-judicial forum. In other words, they were held generally in large auditoriums, and there were usually several hundred citizen spectators. And then there was a table with the witness, and there was another table with the lawyers, and then there was a separate table with the 4 commissioners. So the lawyer would go through the witness's testimony, and again, it was all videotaped and it was transcribed. And then the commissioners would, I don't know if cross-examine is a proper term, but we would ask questions as well of the witnesses. So it was a wide-ranging process, and that kind of led to why the report ended up being 5,342 pages, as you noted.
Yeah.
It was a tremendously huge and broad task, and it was reflected in what we produced, I believe. And we did all of that. We started the hearings in March of 2023, and we submitted our interim report in September of 2023, which we're going to talk about later. And we submitted our final 5,000-page report in November 28th of 2023. So incredible timeline. Particularly when you consider it was all done with volunteers, and I think it's a testimony to Canadians. It's an encyclopedia of what happened in Canada, and it's probably the springboard for Canadians to realize they're not alone and to start the healing process within the citizenry.
I see. I see. And I can see where you got yourself involved in this. Your description, and to me, all these volunteers, thousands of people volunteering, it sounds like an uprising. It sounds like a freedom convoy type of deal where people just got together and they started driving east, to be in Ottawa for 3 weeks or so. It was everybody felt like they had a part to play, and they played it.
It was typical Canadian grassroots fashion. When we were going city to city, we started in Truro, Nova Scotia, and we didn't have the money for the next city. So it was just kind of dribbling in, and each set of hearings cost us 30 grand, and that was room rentals and so on and so forth. And I remember, people sometimes ask me, well, why were you in Truro, Nova Scotia? Why not Halifax? Well, we were going to be in Halifax, and the venue canceled on us, so at the last minute. And the same thing happened in Toronto. It happened in Saskatoon. It happened in Langley, because we were supposed to be in Vancouver, but we couldn't get a hotel that would accommodate us in Vancouver. We went to Langley. Same in Quebec. We were going to be in Montreal. We ended up in Quebec City. So this thing, it was so organic. And being you'd mentioned the commissioners were independent, and they really were independent. As a matter of fact, I can tell you, when we sat down in the morning for the first day's hearing in Saskatoon, it was kind of like, you heard the old expression about the duck. It's just kind of placid going along in the water, but when you look underneath, its legs are kicking like crazy. Well, we commissioners had no idea what was going on, but in Saskatoon, we filed in the morning, we took our seats, and what was going on in the background is all the witnesses for day one had dropped out. They were afraid. They were afraid of backlash. They were afraid of losing their jobs, and so we had to So the commissioner, not the commissioners, but the commission were busy phoning all the alternate witnesses. And, you know, from the commissioner standpoint, we didn't even know. And the first witness came in and we started, and we didn't know until days later what had actually happened. But that was the story, you know,
Is
and
that
I
amazing?
say it's in typical Canadian grassroots fashion. You know, you have an idea, you go forward with it, and you make do, and you try to make it work. And that's what we did.
It's almost as though Providence had a hand in helping the whole thing unfold. Now, when we talk about your work, the actual work you did, I would like to cut away to for a little bit to the cover page of your interim report. Okay. Now, this interim report came out in September 14. It was much shorter than the final report. And if I just roll down here, I highlighted one section. Oh, it looks like that section has gone. But the section dealt with basically the approval. I'll go back to the cover page. Basically, the approval of the vaccines for the Wuhan virus. The interim report concentrates on that approval process, and the one thing I homed in on was the fact that you addressed the approval process, and you mentioned the fact, or the inquiry mentioned the fact that it was kind of a one blanket, one size fits all type of process. Everybody gets the vaccine, even children, and I really homed in on that even children part. So could you explain why you decided to go with an interim report to really home in on that safe and effective narrative?
Well, I want to let folks know that this interim report has been incorporated into the final report. So it is in the final report as it was. But come September, that's when the children were starting to go back to school. And the government launched a campaign trying to get parents to vaccinate their children. And they were talking about the children were not safe. They were talking about boosters. And that new version of the biological treatment, because it was not a vaccine, you know, despite what they tell you,
Yeah.
and it's interesting that even when the mainstream media, I'm gonna drift a little bit here, but it was interesting that when the mainstream media actually talked about and admitted that, well, they did adjust the definition of what a vaccine is. That was even a lie of omission, because they actually adjust that definition. I think it was 25 or 30 times during
Oh,
that period of time. And we have that in our report too. And you can actually go back to the CDC website and use something called the Wayback Machine, and you could see how often they changed it. So every month something new was coming out about a vaccine, so they would tweak the definition. So it was tweaked over and over and over again. But again, I digress. So the new version of the vaccine that came out in late summer and fall of 2023 again had gone through the same cycle of not having been tested. It wasn't tested on children. Children were not at risk, and yet they were pushing this thing. So, but when we talk overall about the how the vaccines became authorized in Canada, they were never approved, by the way. They were authorized. And the way they did it was they issued, it's different than the United States. You keep hearing about an emergency order in the United States. And in Canada, we don't have that. So in Canada, the government issued an interim order.
yes.
And what the interim order was, it actually exempted the COVID-19 shots from having to prove objectively that they were safe and that they were effective. And I think it might be worthwhile to explain what I mean by objectively. There's two kinds of questions, basically. One's an objective question, one's a subjective question. An objective question might be, what's 2 plus 2? And the answer is 4. A subjective question might be, well, how do you feel about 2 plus 2? Well, of course, you
Yeah.
can feel any way you want about it. So what the government did was they went into the regulations for approval of any kind of a drug in Canada, and they took the safe and effective clauses, and they said, all we need is enough information that it might be concluded that these things are safe and effective. And then they approved it on that basis, or authorized it, I should say, on that basis. Now, the other interesting thing is the
Wow.
the interim order could only last 12 months. So what the government did, and people can go online, and it's in our overall report, and then you can actually We go through an entire section of exactly how this was done, how the government authorized it. But you can go in and you can see that following the interim order, the government actually permanently changed the regulations for approval of drugs, and they have now exempted permanently COVID-19 shots from proving objective safety and objective effectiveness. And it exists on the books now.
Well,
So
that is absolutely incredible. I mean, how could that even be legal? I mean, when you take, well, there's a couple of issues here because first off, they shoved down our throats that this was a safe and effective medicine for
yeah,
everyone to take. Well, right there, that they're lying to us. They lied to us throughout the whole process of producing the vaccines and distributing them, and they're lying to us now because they are still saying it's safe and effective. So there's a big lie there. And then the other thing is how could they change a process, an approval process, to allow the elephant to walk through the room? I mean, there's no way that you really putting the public health the public health of the nation at risk
oh yeah,
if you don't know objectively that what you are distributing is really truly safe and effective.
absolutely. And they violated so many longstanding practices during COVID. As a matter of fact, I'm just looking at the beautiful photo you've got on your wall of 2 jet aircraft there.
Oh yeah.
And that's appropriate, because when I look at those 2 jet aircraft, their relative velocity, their relative speed is probably 0. They're both
That's
going
right.
at the same, but their absolute speed is probably, I don't know what it would be, 400, 500, 600, 700 miles an hour.
400 knots. Yeah.
And they actually, the government reported and the pharmaceutical companies reported the efficacy, in other words, the effectiveness of the vaccines in relative terms as opposed to absolute terms. And again, absolute terms would tell you what your chances of getting and dying of the disease was, and then it would say what your absolute terms of reducing that risk were. But instead, what they did was, just like your 2 jet airplanes, whose relative speed is 0, they used a relative measure, which is absolutely meaningless. So this was a well thought out program. I mean, I can't tell you why they did it, but it's a well thought out program where they covered a lot of different bases in order to present this narrative and then drive it day after day, 24 hours a week,
So
ruthlessly doing it.
it was just like a propaganda machine. But when you talk about, for our viewers, when you talk about relative risk, could you give an example here? I think what you're talking about is they take a look at if they have one group is vaccinated and the other group isn't vaccinated.
Yep.
And in one group you have one person who comes down with COVID and dies, and then in the other group you have 2 people. It doesn't matter that in each group you had 1 million people, but you had one person in one group die and 2 persons in the other group, and therefore you could say the relative risk between the two is what, in the order of 50% or
Exactly. You
yeah.
hit it exactly on. It all has to do with the overall sample size. And like you said, if you were examining 2 samples of people, one sample that didn't have a vaccine and one sample that did, let's say there's only 10 people in each sample, and one dies in the vaccinated group and 2 die in the unvaccinated group, well, you're going to say you have a 50% efficacy. But now let's not change any of the parameters except the size of the sample. So now you've got 1 million people in the vaccinated group and 1 dies, and you have 1 million people in the unvaccinated and 2 people dies. They will still tell you the relative efficacy is 50%. It's the same. But when you look at 1 died in 1 million, as opposed to 2 dying in 1 million, your overall chances of dying are almost 0 in both instances. So why would you take an experimental, non-tested, non-proven experimental drug into your body? It's that simple, and it was never explained to our citizens that they had done this.
Well, what that really does when they go the relative risk route is they really distort the risk benefit analysis, don't they? And
Exactly.
and this is important because because in your interim report you talk about, okay, these vaccines were being shoved down to our children as well. And it was a well-known fact well beforehand that children did not seem to suffer from COVID-19. They shrugged it off and they didn't seem to pass it on, and there was no risk for them involved with not taking the vaccine. But they were basically coerced into do it to save grandma and save grandpa.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible. And you know, before they even came out with the original lockdowns in March of 2020, they knew. We had testimony, and I can't recall who the doctor was, but
Yeah.
it may have been Dr. Marcus, but they testified that the government had statistics from January of 2020, February, and March. And those statistics were showing you that the people that were affected and dying were 80 plus years old with multiple comorbidities. So they knew that before they locked us down. And the other thing that people perhaps don't remember or didn't know is that in March, I think it was March 10th, or I don't remember, but when they locked us down the first time in March 10th, there was one person who was over 80, I think it was 82 years of age, who had supposedly died from COVID, one in a population of 40 million. And they apparently had somewhere around 1,200 people who were infected with COVID out of a population of 40 million. So given those numbers, and given the fact that they knew who was affected, they knew that in January and February, why did we go into this lockdown that actually killed thousands of people?
Now, I'm wondering, did you have anyone from the government come and testify before you to give their side of the story and to provide the balance that the inquiry sure could have used? But did you have anybody come in from the government?
Well, we issued 63 subpoenas to all kinds of different government officials, and only one of them, one out of 63, acknowledged that they got the subpoena and said that they would not be attending. Now, it's important to note that, and you had mentioned it before, we visited 8 cities in Canada, 3 days in each city. So the process of hearings went on for 2.5 months. And we gave, on the subpoena, we gave the government officials choice of any day, any time they wanted, any time of the day, any of those 24 days, and they could appear in person or they could appear by electronic means, by Zoom or whatever we were using. And not a single one of them showed up. Now, there were a few politicians who did show up. There was a member of the legislature in Ontario that showed up who had been kicked out of the caucus because he refused to take a shot.
Yes,
So,
Nichols, I believe, was his name. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And so, no, we gave them every opportunity. We made it easy for them. We invited them. It was a controlled process. They could have brought their own lawyers. They chose not to. And the Canadian people should be very much aware of that. And I want to add one more thing to that before we leave.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, look, I'm not shilling for anybody, but it wasn't just the Liberals and the NDP. The PC party did not attend either. We invited them directly. As a matter of fact, I met with a member of parliament afterwards, who was a member of the PC party, and he told me that only 5 in the PC party internally raised any kind of concerns about this, and they were all backbenched, by the way, including that person.
By PC, you mean the Conservative Party of Canada, the
Conservative Party? Yeah, sorry, the Conservative Party of Canada, CPC. Yeah.
Well, that's really telling because, and it maybe speaks to the fact that they all support these measures going forward. They all clapped like seals when they were rolled out, and maybe the last thing they want to do is go back and kind of revisit what happened and what they had, what hand they had in all the things that progressed. But it certainly also indicates that there's probably no way that we can anticipate that the government of our day is going to do anything but a biased accounting of what happened, because they're just too complicit. They're just too involved.
Yeah, and that stretches to all of the institutions in Canada. It's not just the government directly, but for instance, the Supreme Court of Canada. These people are supposed to be the creme de la creme of our legal minds. And
Yes.
yet, when the convoy was in Ottawa, the Justice Wagner, who's the
Yeah.
head of the Supreme Court, made a statement that the convoy was illegal. And it
Yes.
hadn't been judged as illegal anywhere in Canada. As a matter of fact, the judge in Ottawa, who was looking into the noise disturbance, essentially
Yes.
told them that you stop honking and you can continue with your legal protest. And yet, our
Yes.
Chief Justice is making these statements. So, do you think that we can get a fair shake in the Supreme Court of Canada? You think Justice Wagner will excuse himself during
No.
during the I shouldn't say any, I should say, given the inevitability of cases coming to the Supreme Court now?
No, there's absolutely no way. No, it's extremely disappointing fact that you point out there with really the bias that is that is unfolding across the land. But as we move from the interim report and go to the final report, as you mentioned, there's 5,300 pages there. I'm gonna throw up a cutaway here shortly, just to introduce some of the topics we can touch upon. But from your perspective, how can that's scary? 5,300 pages. How can a regular Canadian approach the final approach or the final report?
Well, we were very much aware. I'm an engineer, and I was very much aware that because of the broad scope of this thing, again, we were not restricted in scope. We were just told, or we were just mandated to write a report that reflected the testimony that we got, and we got testimony that touched every thread of the fabric of Canadian society.
Yeah.
So we were very much aware of the how intimidating this was, and I want to say that of the 5,342 pages, 4,699 are transcripts, actual transcripts of all the testimony. Only 643 pages is analysis. Now that's still scary, but
Yeah.
what we did to make it easy was we split it up into sections. And what I always suggest to people is that the first thing you should do is go to section 9 and section 10. I think each of those sections is 4 or 5 pages. And what that is, it's an overall statement from the commissioners to the people of Canada. Then the next thing I tell folks is go to the table of contents. Table of contents itself is like 15, 20 pages long.
Yeah.
Go to section 8 in the table of contents. And what section 8 is, it's just simply a bullet listing of all of our 400 or so recommendations. And they're grouped into all kinds of headings. For instance, I'm just looking on my other screen. We have a section on Canada's justice system. We have a section on coercion, policing, neglect and isolation of seniors, sustained propaganda, the CBC, mainstream media, early treatments, immunity, Canada's vaccine adverse reactions reporting system. So it's all split up. And so what I tell people is go to section 8 in the table of contents, go through and find a topic that you're really interested in. Go to section 8 and read it.
Well, let's do that. Let's do that right now. Let's share the screen here, and because what I did was I set it up beforehand. Here's your we're into the table of contents here.
Okay. Now,
and you can see I opened it up at Responsible Canadian Courts, but for the audience, you can see that you can pick whichever item you want to delve into, and it's all hyperlinked, so you can go directly to any part of the final report that you want and take a gander if you want. So it's very, very nicely set up and easy to use. It's very utile.
And what you've got there on the screen right now is section 7. So let's just we won't click on it, but let's say right on the top there it says section 7.1.2 responsive Canadian courts. And in section 7, you can see we do an introduction, we give some preamble, we talk about all kinds of different things, and at the very bottom it says recommendations. Now, if you go to section 8, which would be, and you want to see this, you go section 8.1.2 is also the response of Canadian courts, but in section 8, all it is the recommendation section. So if you went to section 8.1.2 and you read those recommendations, what you would find is it would tweak your interest, and then you would go to section 7. Now you would read all the wheres and how fors and all the analysis and how we came up with those, and then you can go on to the next one and the next one and the next one. So you can do this like little bite-sized pieces. It's kind of like just trying to think of examples. It's kind of like the Bible. You know, most people don't sit down and pick it up and start reading on page 1, but they go through different chapters and different headings, and they study it, and then they move on to the next, and then they build an overall picture in their mind doing that. And that's the way to handle it, you know, in bite-sized pieces, and pieces that you're interested in to begin with, and then it will flow into the rest.
Indeed. Now, when we talk about, we looked at, let's talk about the response of the Canadian courts in your final report. I had that up on we shared that, and we could see that that's prominently figured in your final report. What did you find about the court response to, and our membership is extremely interested in this because we're very interested in civil liberties and charter rights and freedoms. How do charter rights and freedoms fare throughout this process?
Well, you know what? I write a blog post. I'm not just involved with the National Citizens Inquiry, but as an outcrop of the National Citizens Inquiry, when we were writing the report, that's all fine. And, you know, we have a report and it's a toolbox and it's like an alarm system, but then what do you do with it? And so I'd started with another fellow, we started another group called Manitoba Stronger Together.ca, and we've written blog posts on this. And, you know, in the blog post, I compared the Canadian Constitution to an umbrella. So in 1981 or 1982, when the Constitution was it wasn't really passed because Quebec never signed off on it, but it was kind of like the government told us, you've got this umbrella and it's going to protect you from the rain. The Constitution is going to protect you from government overreach. Yep. And so for 40 years, we carried around that darn umbrella and we never opened it up and looked at it. And when it started to rain, in 2020, we opened up that umbrella. In other words, we tried to exercise our constitutional rights, and that umbrella was full of holes. It was all moth-eaten, and the rain just came through. That was our Constitution. There's a clause in it. It's really interesting because the initial clause, and I haven't got it in front of me, so I'm not going to quote, but essentially the very first opening in the Constitution says that our rights are given by God, and we're founded by the principles of justice. And then the next clause says, oh, but these rights are limited by the government if they think it's necessary. They don't actually outline what the necessary. So I guess the government's above God. Yeah. But that's essentially what happens. So, you know, anything works. You know, your house insurance works every day until you need it. And if you need it, your house burns down and it's not, and it just, they've got out clauses. Oh, we don't have to replace your house if it was sunny that day. Yeah. That's, but here's the thing.
I think, Ken, you're talking about Section 1, the limitations clause that says that all rights are subject to being revised or reviewed, subject to demonstrable demonstrations that the breach can be justified. And that Section 1 is quite clear, and when it says that you've got to demonstrably justify overriding of these rights. And throughout the course of the pandemic, I didn't see where this evidence was allowed to come forward. It was as if the courts were turning this evidence back and giving the government what they call a margin of appreciation. We have to trust the government, they said, that they know better. And as far as I know, that kind of goes against the whole concept of separation of powers. Yeah. When the courts are there to ensure the government doesn't get carried away, our courts are turning around and saying we have to allow the governments to get away with everything because they know better.
Yeah, you're right, and it's incredible. I mean, the courts used a principle called judicial notice. Yes. And essentially what judicial notice was intended to be was if the two parties in a disagreement agreed on something, then they would take judicial notice of that because it wasn't in dispute. But what the courts did in Canada was they said, well, the government says that the vaccines are safe and effective, therefore we're taking judicial notice of that. Even though that was the argument, they took the side of the government. And what's even more incredible than that is that these judges are supposed to be independent of the government. In other words, they essentially have tenure, if you say it in a term that most Canadians can understand. And yet they picked up the water for the government. They used judicial tools like mootness and
Yes.
judicial review, and
Yes.
and we did not, and we do not have rule of law in Canada. And just so folks understand what I mean by rule of law, what rule of law means is that it doesn't matter how big or tall or strong or powerful you are, when you stand in front of the judge, the two sides are equal. And
Yes.
that's not what happened in Canada. You know,
Oh
when
my goodness.
yeah, when the entire argument before the court was accepted under the declaration of judicial notice.
Mhm.
How does that, you know, and the other thing that folks really need to understand, and most people don't, is that the courts are not just there to make rulings. The courts are there as a societal pressure relief valve. In other words, there's always going to be disagreements between people. There's always going to be different agreements between people and the government and their institutions. But they
Yeah.
need to be assured that when they go to the judicial process, that they will be heard fairly. And if they're not, it breeds contempt in the country, and it can lead to violence, you know,
Yes.
because people are frustrated that they can't get a fair shake in the court. So what do? They take it into their own hands. So this game that the judiciary has been playing is extremely dangerous.
Yes. Well, that's from that, what we're describing here is a truly broken system,
Yes.
is a system that calls itself democratic and free, but a system that is anything but. And the other thing I'd like to draw attention to is the fact that this is all happening at the top with our government, our courts, but it's all infiltrating down into our institutions and our government agencies, and we see this corruption now filtering into uh, areas of employment, of labor, of military, of police. We have a case now in Ottawa where a police detective, Helen Gruss, is being disciplined. She's undergoing disciplinary proceedings because she thought it was a good idea to investigate the vaccination status of mothers who had babies, newborns, who suddenly died. Well, she can't do that. You can't go there because that's the unspeakable narrative. You cannot cross that narrative that says it's safe and effective. So we see all of our government agencies now are playing this game of judicial notice.
Yep.
We don't have to hear your concerns. We don't care what you say because someone other than you knows better. A personal here's a personal observation. I have a son. He's a crackerjack software developer, and he notes that you look around at the marketplace to sell your wares, and he notes that there are places uh, where they have limits. You cannot be employed by certain companies if you're not vaccinated. So where is this coming from? The Wuhan virus is gone. And still out in labor land, we have companies who say we can't employ you if you're not vaccinated. Would you like to comment on that? What?
Yeah. Well, you know what you're describing actually is fascism.
Yeah.
People think that fascism has to do with swastikas and jackboots and stuff.
Mm.
It does historically, but what fascism is, there's a difference between communism and fascism. Communism is when the government controls all means and methods of production, society in general. What fascism is when the government teams up with corporations and they control all the means and methods of productions, what you can or cannot do, what you can or cannot say. So
Yeah.
just quickly looking at what happened in Canada. So you had banks, which were supposedly private institutions, who blindly froze people's accounts. And I've not heard one bank tell me that they had legal opinion on that. We had employers who were firing people. We had doctors who, and I'm saying this word on purpose, executed people, and I'm referring to Sheila Lewis.
Yes.
They executed her, folks, and it's incredible if you actually read the transcripts of the trial and the decisions made by judges, because
No,
Sheila
just for the
Lewis,
audience, Ken. Just for the audience. Sorry, Sheila Lewis. She was from Alberta, and she required an organ transplant. She wasn't vaccinated. I think she didn't. She already had COVID, and she already had resistance to the Wuhan virus. but she didn't want to get vaccinated for her own personal medical situation, and they accordingly they would not give her a transplant, and she died.
Well, a really important point on this is, though, that they demanded that she get the COVID-19 vaccine in the summer and or fall of 2022. And the reason that's important is we already knew at that time the vaccine was dangerous. It didn't prevent spread. It didn't stop you from getting it. As a matter of fact, according to the CDC, the number one side effect of the COVID vaccine was getting COVID infection.
Yes.
So they already knew all of this. And she was tested in a laboratory to prove that she had antibodies against COVID, and they still stuck to their guns. Now, at the very last minute, they reversed themselves, but it was already too late, and she passed away last summer.
Yeah.
So, that was those doctors. Their education was paid for by you and I, the taxpayer, because their tuition didn't cover what it cost. Their training after graduation was paid for by us. They work in government hospitals paid for by us, and all of their salaries come from us, the taxpayers. Somehow the appeals court ruled that they were not subject to the requirements of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms because they were not part of the government.
No, that's a favorite ploy, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I wish Revenue Canada would offer that, because any of you people out there who are in business know that Revenue Canada has very strict rules as to whether you're working for a company or not. And those doctors, certainly, according to Revenue Canada, would be working for the government. But somehow the appeals court came up with a different decision. So, this it's interesting. An interesting point is I've been watching lately on the news, and I don't watch CBC, I watch alternate news. But the government's doing this whole big thing about car thefts right now, and car thefts are an important thing. But the federal government's looking into it. The government, all the mainstream media is talking about it. How many are they looking into the 3 years that just passed, where the government intruded upon every aspect of Canadians' lives? They bankrupted people. They murdered people. They affected every child in this country. They broke up families, and there's no investigation. But car thefts. They've got all kinds of meetings and hearings going on about that right now.
It's almost as if they're purposely trying to distract from the elephant in the room, isn't it? All these little things crop up, and you can see on the legacy media, they go at it day after day after day. I think we're a week into this car theft crisis now, and they just won't let it go because they got nothing else to talk about.
Well, it just came to my mind, and I don't want to forget this point, but if folks think this is over, they've done another thing. I can tell you that, and you can go look this up. Winnipeg Free Press, which is a very large, a very old newspaper in Canada, according to the Frontier Center, by the way, half of their operating budget comes from the government, but that's another issue. But January 15th of 2023, the Winnipeg Free Press published an article that was called "The Unwanted Unvaxxed." And this lunatic who wrote this article was talking about how the unvaxxed people were infecting everyone else, and how she had actually fantasized what would be written on these terrible people's tombstones about how they died of the COVID virus. Now, this was published January 15th, 2024, just a few weeks ago.
Okay.
In our group, ManitobaStrongerTogether.ca, we wrote letters to the editor, but we also wrote letters to the advertisers of the Winnipeg Free Press. And guess what? We got an apology. But the question remains, how in January of 2024 does a major Canadian newspaper write such an article, get it through the editorial process, get all the approvals, and then print the darn thing now? So if you think this is over, folks, it isn't.
No, I hope it isn't over, because we are just well down the path here of destroying our nation. I'm from the military. I have a military background, and I look what's happening in the military today, and they can't retain people. People are rushing out the door. They want to get away from this. First off, forced and coerced vaccinations. Which, by the way, was ruled on by a grievance panel, and they found that yes, the military did coerce its members into getting vaccinated under pain of release. So we're at a point now where our own military is basically inoperational. It's not operational because it doesn't have the manpower it needs to do the jobs that are required of it. So we're well down a path of national destruction here.
Yeah, well, we had testimony on that, and two really interesting points from our testimony. The first was that Canadian Armed Forces lost more personnel due to the mandates and all that other kind of people were quitting, they were being fired, and so on and so forth. We lost more personnel from Canadian Armed Forces over the mandates and whatnot than we did since World War II.
Oh,
and
okay.
and the other part that somebody said is they said, the military command structure operates due to trust and respect. And when you had these, there was a lot of people don't know there was a large shuffling of command structures in the Canadian Armed Forces there, and there was some. I don't want to suggest it was serendipitous charges against various people, but in any case, the whole command structure was sorted through, and the operational personnel do no longer trust their command personnel, and that's death to a military organization.
Yeah. No, it's not a fighting organization when you don't have that trust. You don't have that bond between leader and follower. You do not have an operational force. No, I can attest to that for point blank. Now, we could go on. We could talk about this. Is so interesting, Ken. We could go on forever and ever, but we have to we have to get down to brass tacks here and close it up. And I gotta as kind of a last question. I'll ask you, where does NCI go from here? What do you see happening in the future for NCI?
Well, that's an ongoing discussion right now, but first off, folks can go to www.thenationalcitizensinquiry.ca, and they can download the report for free. They can watch the hearings. The hearings are set out. There's a menu item that says hearings. You click on that, it gives you all 8 cities. You click on that, and then every single person who testified is listed, and you click on that person, it takes you to a separate page, gives you the video, the transcript, it gives you all kinds of information. So it's all there, folks. Transcripts, report, videos, everything. So nationalcitizensinquiry.ca. Now, there's 2 streams that are going to occur with the National Citizens Inquiry. The first stream is the propagation and protection of the report that we released on November 28th. So you're going to see a group within the NCI that's going to be promoting that. They're going to be supporting that. They're going to be maintaining the website. You will be able to purchase printed books from Amazon Books shortly. And folks, it's in 11 different volumes because a book on Amazon can't be more than 600 pages. And I believe the books are being sold at cost. So that's one branch of the tree. The other branch of the tree, it's still being discussed, but they're talking about continuing with additional hearings. Perhaps those hearings will be further related to COVID, because there were some things that we didn't cover because we didn't get testimony on. Or the National Citizens Inquiry may pick up additional issues and investigate those. And that will be at the pleasure of the Canadian people. So we'll be asking the citizenry, we'll be doing polling. What do you want us to do? How do you want us to proceed? So I'm anticipating that you'll see a whole lot. There may be hearings starting again yet in the late spring and early summer. And the sky's the limit for what the
what I see. It sounds like what you're describing there in that second branch, that second avenue or approach is kind of a representative body, a body that's representative of the people of Canada, like our own politicians are supposed to be. So you're actually taking the place or forming a representational body that people can people can use to get their point across, which is amazing. Which is it's incredible. You shouldn't have to go there, but I guess that's where we need to go in Canada today. And I'm wondering, this is a last question. Does the work you did at NCI, is it catching on internationally? Because I could see other nations taking a great interest, particularly the Americans. They probably are very, very interested in the work that you've compiled here.
There's a lot of rumblings going on. I did an interview a week ago in the UK, And I am starting to do interviews in the United States now as well. Now, we
Yes.
have had some contact with Australia and a number of other foreign countries. I'm not involved in that part of it, but it's a slow process because the mainstream media have ignored us, and that's so incredible when you think about it, because the National Citizens Inquiry has never been done before in the world, to our knowledge. There's never has citizens gotten together, sponsored a national inquiry, written a report, never been done before in the world. And it was participated with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Canadians, watching, viewing. I think our website's in the 20 to 30, 35 million impressions now.
Oh.
And the mainstream media hasn't said a thing about it. A CBC one tiny article when we were in Winnipeg, and that was because somebody knew the reporter, and they carried I think one line of text. So all that does, the mainstream media's purposeful ignoring of us just slows the process down a bit, but it also lends the process a whole lot of credibility when it's not being carried by these government paid for propaganda mouthpieces.
Well, there's a famous line that came out of a Ernest Hemingway novel, The Sun Also Rises, and one of the characters, Bill, was asked how he went bankrupt, and his answer was gradually, then all of a sudden. And I can see that happening here. You say it's a slow process, it's a slog right now, but I can see where this thing's going to just rip open and take everybody by surprise, especially our legacy media.
Oh yeah, I mean they're dying. I mean it's an incredible thing. They're so arrogant. I watched an interview just the other day with the head of the CBC. I can't remember the lady's name, but of course the CBC, and I folks, just so that you know, I actually have the CBC's annual report here. They missed all of their targets last year,
Yes.
all of them, and she's
Yes.
still talking about giving them bonuses. And what did you get for $1.4 billion that you paid to the CBC last year? They have, according to their own report, they actually have 1.8% of the news market. And they
Wow.
have 4.4 or 4 point some percent of the overall broadcasting market. That's what you got for 1.4 billion. And they're rewarding themselves with bonuses. What do you think about that,
Okay.
Canadians?
Okay. Well, I think a scintillating discussion, Ken. Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed this, and all the best to you and the folks at National Citizens Inquiry. And as I say, it looks like Providence is having a hand in this whole process. And I got a feeling it's going to continue. So thanks again, Ken.
Thank you for having me.